Hi folks, and welcome back to the Class Creative Arts channel. In this art tutorial we're going to produce a landscape painting using only two colours plus white. This is going to demonstrate how to mix a range of tints and tones, which spins off from my previous tutorial about colour theory, where we ran through some of the basics in colour mixing to bridge any of your knowledge gaps about colour theory. Materials you'll need when creating this session is something to paint on. Here I'm using a canvas panel, A3 sized. You're going to need some paint palettes, pots of water to wash out your brushes, some white acrylic paint and two colours. So the two colours I'm using here is burnt sienna, which is an orangey brown colour, and also ultramarine blue. The brushes I used are a 2-inch decorator's brush, a medium-sized flathead, a thin-tip brown head brush and a fan brush. To begin my painting, I'm going to start by making a viewfinder, which in this case is a cut-out piece of card to frame the exact view that I want to help emphasise certain parts of my composition. Making a viewfinder for yourself is really helpful as you get to explore which views work best for what you're trying to achieve. For me, I want to pick out the area of the image that has the most visual interest, so I decided to position the little white cottage roughly into the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds splits an image into thirds vertically and horizontally, as shown in this grid. Artists will often separate the foreground and background content by using horizontal lines. So to begin, I start off by putting an underpainting of diluted burnt sienna on my canvas board, and you just want to pass your decorator's brush back and forth, making sure that you have long continuous sweeps. Try not to stop in the middle so that you don't get any of those jarring lines. And because we've got sky in the picture, we want to make sure that our brush strokes are nice and smooth. While the underpainting dries, let's create a palette of colour mixes as a warm-up activity using the two colours plus white to show the range of shades, tints and tones that are achievable. For this, I've just mapped out where I wanted the colour mixes to go, but you can do this just by eye. And I'm using a flathead brush with barely any water. I just dampened the brush to make the neat shape. So I'm starting out with our burnt sienna here. I did actually apply a couple of layers of this paint because I was working on a piece of card that didn't have much grip to it. So on the right hand side here, you've got your burnt sienna, and then to the far left, you've got your ultramarine blue. Once you've painted those two plain colours in, then we're going to get into mixing. So mixing between them. So I'm just starting off with a little of our burnt sienna, and then I'm bringing in a little bit of the ultramarine blue, and you can instantly see when you mix that into a tight mix of paint, it comes out as a much darker tone. This was the tone that I played with within the darkness and shadow of the mountain itself. And I'm just going to lay that down in just some flat strokes. So if it's a slightly warmer tone, it would be closer to your burnt sienna, because burnt sienna gives us a certain warmth as it has got those warmer oranges in it. Next, I need to make a darker tone, so I just mix a little bit more ultramarine with this. And as you can see, it's a cooler tone, so I'm putting it more towards the ultramarine blue. Already you can see the very vast difference of those four different colours and those shades. And then once we've done that, then we're going to do the same mixes, but then make it a little lighter as a tint by adding touches of white. So to achieve a burnt sienna tint, all you need to do is take some of that original burnt sienna paint and just mix in a tiny touch of white to lighten it into a lighter tint. You can see here in my brush strokes that there are actually some strands of colour that haven't been tightly mixed. This is what you call a loose mix. Sometimes you want that effect because it gives you strands of different sweeps. However, you might want to do a tighter mix when you're coming up with a colour chart like this. So I'm just blending it in a little more to make it more solid. Now we're going to move down the chart. So we're going to mix up a little bit of ultramarine into the burnt sienna. To get that original darker brown sort of colour. And once you've achieved that colour, you can always test it on the colour that you pre-mixed to make sure it is the same. And then after doing that, you just simply add a touch of white to make it a tint. And to finish the colour chart off, the same applies for the other two colours. So mixing that darker ultramarine shade with a little bit of burnt sienna, and then going for our plain ultramarine blue with just a touch of white to make a ultramarine blue tint. So now that the backing board is dry with our burnt sienna underpainting, I'm going to mix up a sky colour using ultramarine blue and titanium white. You can either loosely mix it as I'm doing here. I'm also going to be using a dampened decorator's brush. This is a 2-inch brush, and just passing the brush as we did before, just with sweeping horizontal strokes, just to really cover 3/4 of that sky, because only a small amount of it is showing at the top. It's also important not to keep it as one solid blue. If you can have some streaks of that darker ultramarine as well, it just gives more of a natural gradient effect to the sky. Once the sky is dried enough, we're going to take this sponge and we're going to create our clouds effects. So I'm not actually going in with the bright titanium white. I'm using a little bit of that blue from the sky that we mixed up before, just to make it a slightly off-white. And also I'm going to add some sort of the mushroomy brown colour into that to give it a bit of shadow as well, but only very slightly. So I'm just bringing this plate up to the camera so you can see just the sort of tint that we're going for. And when you apply your sponge, be quite gentle, don't have big splodges of paint, just less is more, and slowly build up the definition and the solidarity of that cloud as you go. Keep referring back to your reference image as well to make sure that the shapes are correct, so that the outer perimeter of your clouds are light and not too heavy, and just have fun with it. Now the background is dry, we're going to go in with the midground, and as you can see there are two mountains here, one that is further in the distance, so I'm going to start off with that first. Using the medium flathead brush, you just want to make sure that you've mixed up the right sort of tone for the mountain. This one's more of a light blue, so I'm just using the edge of my flathead brush just to fill in those main shapes first. Next you can mix up your mid-tone browns and your darker browns, and I've switched paint brushes here to a round tip brush just to make the marks that resemble shadows and ridges in that background mountain in the distance. Once you're happy with the marks made in the distance mountain, then you can move on to mixing up a very dark brown. So taking lots of ultramarine blue and also some of that burnt sienna, we want to get to the darkest tone that we can achieve. And once you're happy with the tone, then move on to the flathead brush, and you're just going to use the tip of that flathead brush to mark out the shape of that large mountain, making sure that it overlaps the background mountain in the distance. Once you've marked the outline of that large mountain, paint the interior of it, and then towards the base of the mountain we want to go in for a mid-tone brown to warm that area up. So I'm just using the flathead brush, and while the paint is still semi-wet, just doing a bit of blending to merge it into the mountain. I'm also going to be using a sponge to texturize, give it a little bit of visual texture to the surface. Obviously there's lots of rocks that have surface and pattern as well there, so you want to just randomize and contrast between the very dark tone that you can mix into warm tones, and adding sort of little touches of sort of like a warmer, creamier tint as well, just to give a little bit of variation. Using the round tip paintbrush, you want to then work with your different variants of white. So go for the darker tone of white first. I actually mix the titanium white with a bit of mixed up blue, and you want to just create lots of different sort of flicks within your paintbrush to create the right types of ridges. Really refer to the reference image to make sure that you don't overdo it. Less is more. Once you've finished your darker tone of white, let that dry somewhat, and then you can use your pure brilliant titanium white right at the top of that mountain to really highlight and emphasize where the brightest parts of the snow are. It's very crucial that you do alternate between the darker tints of white and the brightest parts of white. The next bit is to mix up some titanium white with a little bit of brown to create this sort of buff sort of colour. This is where the lightest part of the grass is going to be, so I'm just plotting out with the large flathead brush where I want those lighter parts of the painting to be, just sort of stippling the bristles on the canvas very loosely and very lightly, and also breaking them up, making sure so that some of that underpainting of brown is coming through. Once the mid highlights are done of the grassy areas, then you can go and just plot out where you want that dark stream to be. So I've just mixed up a dark brown and I'm just lightly and loosely plotting that as well. In this section of the painting is where you have to be quite clever with how you play upon the marks that you create to create perspective, depth and distance. So I'm alternating and adding many layers of mid-tone browns, darker tones with the darker blue and brown mixed together, and also some highlights where they are needed. To resemble perspective and the rocks that are in the stream here, I've used a round tip brush and I've sort of just done some marks on the side to create those pebbles and rock type shapes. Also deepening the depth of the bank of the stream with some very, very dark lines. And for the trees in the mid background there, I've actually mixed up sort of a mushroom type brown, and I've also added a little bit of darker blue for the shadow of the trees. For the foreground, I've started to work with a fan brush and also a very fine tip brush, and I'm sort of doing more vertical and slanted strokes, randomized strokes, to really give the impression that it's a grassy area that is closer to us. So if something's going to be closer to us, it's going to be larger in line thickness, and to deepen that area I've also added lots of variation in my tones. You could just watch this section of the video and really understand how all the different marks come into play with each other and are contrasted with each other as well, to give that sense of visual texture. If you got something out of watching this video, please take a second to hit the subscribe button because I'm trying to grow my followers, guys. Thank you very much for supporting me in what I do, much appreciated.